And the first one is John R. McNeill. I copied some very interesting stuff off your website. So he says that he was born and raised in Chicago and passionately devoted to Chicago's professional sports teams. He's a PhD from... You can go farther with that if you want. He's a PhD from Duke University. He's presently on the faculty of Georgetown University, where he holds 2 appointments: Distinguished University Professor, Edmund A. Wall School of Foreign Service, and Distinguished University Professor, Department of History. His areas of expertise include the Anthropocene, environmental history, global cities, global history, and world history. His primary area of research is environmental history, and he has served as president of both the American Society for Environmental History and the American Historical Association. He's author or co-author of 8 books and dozens of scholarly articles. Particularly relevant to this gathering is his volume, Something New Under the Sun, An Environmental History of the 20th Century World, and The Great Acceleration, Environmental History of the Anthropocene since 1945.
Thanks, Phil, for that. As you heard from Dave McGowan, he's working on a project about the Calumet area through the lens of the Anthropocene. So he needed somebody to talk about the Anthropocene. That's me. That's my role today. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit about it. I'm going to try to define it. I'm going to try to explain some of the justifications for the concept, referred to here as scale, scope, and pace of global environmental change. I'll say a little bit about the scientists who are most deeply involved in it and what their agendas are. A little bit about some of the controversies surrounding the concept of the Anthropocene. I'm not going to say anything about the Calumet area, partly because I don't know much about it, but I'm going to learn more about it in the course of the afternoon. So this is sort of big picture framing for what follows. And even though, as a professor, typically when I start talking, it takes me 50 minutes to stop talking, I'm going to try to go through this fast so that we can get to the main act quickly. But I do want to say that I'm not a geologist or the subgroup of geologists that pays attention professionally to things like the Anthropocene. I'm a historian. I'm actually a member of the Anthropocene Working Group. That's a fluke. It's because I wrote this book that Phil mentioned, and a geologist read it and asked me to join the group of scientists that are wrestling with the proposition that a new epoch of geological time should formally be adopted and called the Anthropocene. Now this amusing sign is slightly off target because if it is going to be adopted, which is quite uncertain, it's likely to be an epoch and not an era, and these are different things in geology. So this is, at the moment, a suggestion, a proposition. It's not something that the geologists have necessarily adopted, although they might. It's also a recognition that the Earth system, and I'll explain that very briefly in just a moment, is in a place that is unfamiliar and unlike anything that we know about in the history of the Earth. Earth system science, a fairly new term, intended to recognize the interconnectedness of a whole lot of processes that are, in some cases, atmospheric, oceanic, geological. They involve biogeological cycles of sulfur and nitrogen and carbon, and that's Earth system science. And if you look at the Earth system, well, it's different from what it used to be, and from, insofar as we can tell, what it has been over millions and millions of years. The proposition is also a recognition that human action is responsible for the Earth system being in a different place than ever before. Here's a typo. Markets. Should be markers. Sorry about that. It's also a recognition that suitable markers exist, or probably exist, that will allow geologists to designate a before the Anthropocene and an after the Anthropocene. Geologists have to have this in order to slice up Earth history into intervals of time. I'll say a little bit more about the geological parts of it in a moment, but the term Anthropocene has escaped the control of geologists, and it's used in a lot of different contexts now. Philosophers use it, literary scholars use it, journalists occasionally use it, historians sometimes, not so often, use it. And for those communities, the meaning is a bit looser than it is for geology. And it's something of a synonym for any of these terms, which means, in my view, the term is getting fuzzier because different communities use it for different things. And if the geologists formally adopt it, maybe that will make it less fuzzy and more useful. Okay, back to geology for just a moment. This is the way the geologists divide up Earth history. This is long, long, long ago, and this is more recent. The most recent epoch here, 11,700 years old, the Holocene. Officially, we are in the Holocene right now. The Anthropocene is a proposed revision to this, which would add a teeny little sliver right here of uncertain depth, because there's still arguments that I'll get to in a moment about how old the Anthropocene is as a geological epoch. If it's going to be adopted, part of the justification for it is the tremendous scale, scope, and pace of global environmental change in recent times. And you can see, without being able to focus on any of the small print here, which is not properly in focus, you can see all of these curves, almost all of them, have a sort of hockey stick shape to them. These ones over here represent changes in the Earth system, like carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. You'll see that in detail in just a moment. Or the acidification of the oceans. All of them following this familiar curve. And these ones over here are supposed drivers behind these global environmental changes. So population history, energy use history, I'll touch upon both of those, but there are a whole lot of others too that I won't touch upon. And they all share this trajectory. Okay, what doesn't appear in any of those graphs, but might also be taken as justification for the concept of the Anthropocene in the realm of biology, is the possibility that we are now entering into a mass extinction event, of which there have been 5 in the history of life on Earth. And this is 500 million years ago, and this is today. And the most recent of these, you're probably familiar with. This is the 65 million years ago bolide impact hit the Yucatan Peninsula and is credited with wiping out the dinosaurs and a whole lot of other critters at the same time. But we might be in the early stages, as indicated in this little turn in the graph, of a sixth mass extinction event. Here is a representation of some efforts to chart the rate of extinctions. These kinds of things are pretty spotty because so many species are out there and haven't been properly cataloged. So just how many other kinds of vertebrates there really are, it's approximate. But I think it's plausible to suppose that after 1800, the rate of species extinction amongst mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles has shot upwards. Now I'm going to get into water, energy, and a couple other things in a little bit more detail. So this is the history from the 20th century through 2014 of freshwater withdrawals, as the hydrologists call it. That is water used for irrigation or for municipal uses, and most of it's irrigation if you add up the global total. And what I want your attention to focus on simply is this mid-20th century change in the shape of the curve, a point of inflection. More and more water being taken out of lakes and rivers and aquifers and used for something or other. And the next slide is about dams and how much of the world's rivers are now dammed up. And just take a quick look at North America. The red are the dammed up ones, the blue are the free-flowing ones. So North America, and we're about here, I guess, all the big rivers are dammed up. And that water is often used for electricity generation or irrigation, etc. A couple slides about the atmosphere. What you're looking at is sometimes called the Keeling curve, after the scientist who first began to collect data about the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. 1960 here, they first started charting it in 1957, and 2020 here. So 310 parts per million up to 420 parts per million in my lifetime. And that is really unprecedented in, as far as we can tell, in the entire history of the atmosphere. This is a slightly longer look back to about 1700. And here, where it's fairly stable, this is from ice cores. The direct measurements began only in 1958. But it's reliable data. So you can see here that over a 300-year time scale, it's pretty stable, upticks around the late 19th century in terms of the slope of this curve, and then right around the mid-20th century again, as with freshwater withdrawals, boom. Again, my lifetime. Maybe I'm the problem. And this is a much longer view, 800,000 years ago, and you can see a lot of ups and downs in that carbon dioxide concentration, but always between about 180 and 280 parts per million until the last few decades. So this is kind of repetitive. This is the rhythm of glacial and interglacial moments in Earth history. And then, as you get towards the present, boom, almost instantaneous on this longer time scale. And as I write here, the current rate of rise in CO2 concentrations is about 100 times as fast as the typical exit from a glaciation over the last 800,000 years. So something really different is underway. Why is all this happening? Well, a number of things. For my money, the one most important thing is the scale of energy use in modern history and the variety of energy sources. And this graph shows you both from 1850 to the present, and different bands are different energy sources. So the brown one is coal, the gray one is oil, the blue one natural gas, this teeny little sliver nuclear, and it's all additive. The older forms of energy don't go away. New ones just get added on top. And once again, right around the middle of the 20th century, there's a sharp change in the trajectory, as with the carbon dioxide concentrations. That's directly a result of this energy use, and as with the freshwater withdrawals. And according to one scholar, colleague of mine in the Anthropocene Working Group, more energy has been used, global total, since 1950 than in the preceding 11,000 plus years. That makes, the post-1950 era something different. Why is this happening? It's not just energy. Another line of argument that has some merit to it is that just the sheer number of human beings is an important driver of the Earth system changes that justify the concept of the Anthropocene. This again is a 300-year look. This part, the lighter green, this is projection, and nobody knows if that's really going to be correct or not. But this is the observed and reasonably accurately recorded history of population since 1700. Once again, this is 1950, middle of the 20th century, whoosh, it's taking off. This thin line is the rate of population growth, not the population total. And just in case you're interested in demographic history, that peaked in 1968 and has been going down about as fast as it went up in the first half of the 20th century. And it's now less than half what it was at its peak in my childhood. This is a longer view, shows approximately the same thing. Now, shifting gears. There's a group of scientists that's trying to figure out whether there really is something that the geologists should recognize as the Anthropocene. It's called the Anthropocene Working Group, and geologists are really peculiar creatures. I work with them fairly regularly, and I've known at least one of them since I was a little kid. And they, when they divide up history, they have to vote on it and agree on it. So I'm a historian, and we don't do this. Anybody can proclaim a period or an era, and nobody tries to stop them. If I was to say that this is the Dave McGowan era in the history of Chicago, nobody would try to stop me. They might not follow me, but they wouldn't find this objectionable. But geologists are different. They have an elaborate procedure for deciding whether or not there can be a change in the geological timescale, whether or not there can be officially recognized something such as the Anthropocene. And so the Anthropocene Working Group has to make its recommendation, then a subcommission votes on that, and then an international commission votes on that, and if the vote passes, then the International Union of the Geological Sciences ratifies those votes and accepts it. And this kind of stuff doesn't happen fast. It usually takes decades to get a change in the international geochronographic chart. I'm not getting that name exactly right. At any rate, nobody outside of geology cares anything about any of this except for the Anthropocene. And there, some controversies reign. One other thing I should mention here is that if there are going to be changes in the geological timescale, there has to be something observable in the strata of the Earth, or maybe, second best, in the ice that serves as a marker before and an after. And this is formally called a global stratigraphic section and point, or GSSP. I sometimes call it a birth certificate, but colloquially it's often called a golden spike. And that's an example of one in China. Well, this is like a big statue dedicated to this, and these are huge, I don't know what they're made out of, plaster of Paris or something, images of representations of fossils, marine fossils. So this is the boundary between the Permian and the Triassic. It's 252 million years ago. It was a big, big extinction event in the history of life on Earth. So you got to have one of these, a GSSP, if you're going to change the geological timescale. And that's what the Anthropocene Working Group is doing right now. So it started work in 2009, done a lot of research papers, sent a bazillion emails, dominates my inbox, created a nifty logo. And then in 2019, it voted on these two questions. Basically, should there be an Anthropocene? And if so, should it be dated to about the middle of the 20th century? And the vote was, as you can read here, dominantly in favor of both of these propositions. And now, after that was done in 2019, the group is trying to find the best possible golden spikes, GSSPs. And that work is actively ongoing. There were 12 candidates around the world until last week, and now there are 9 survivors. And by December, there's probably going to be only one. And if I had to bet, it's going to be a lake in Ontario. But I'm usually wrong, so it probably won't be. Okay, the last thing I want to get into, I'll try to make this as quick as I can, is some of the debates about this, because not everybody thinks the Anthropocene is a useful concept or term. Yeah, it's about 20 years old. It's been used very widely. This is all the books in Google Books. The term, these are variations just on capitalization. Whoosh. 2010, it just took off in terms of its frequency in the corpus of published books. Let's skip this one. And get into some of the objections. So the first set of objections are to the term rather than the concept, and it's the prefix that bugs people, anthropos, which means either man or humankind in ancient Greek. And among the objections, the main objection is that this assigns responsibility for the tremendous scale, scope, and pace of modern global environmental change to all humankind equally in an undifferentiated way, and that's not accurate. So the anthropo part of it is unfortunate, and some people get really worked up about this, mainly anthropologists. So they have a whole lot of other terms they prefer, none of which has caught on, none of which is going to catch on.
How do you pronounce that last one?
I've never known how to pronounce that last one. But there's an anthropologist from California who thinks it's just the thing.
What does it mean?
But I don't even know what it means. There's something about multi-species collaboration producing environmental change. But
Isn't that where the Nobel Prize winning thing was? Like, that's what I thought you said, when you would show the person in that prefix, it was awarded. Maybe that's
okay, the Nobel Prize winning guy.
where he first coined the term, but that CHU, I thought that's what I said.
No, that's somebody else who did that.
Cthulhu.
That was Paul Crutzen, the Dutch atmospheric chemist who, he didn't invent the term, but he began its popularization about 20 years ago. He got a Nobel Prize for something else.
But he was in a conference, I think.
Yes.
In that, and I thought that was the prefix.
Cthulhu
No.
is a fictional creature created by H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote horror stories in the 1920s. And these creatures came to Earth ages ago, were hidden, but then they re-emerged to destroy the planet. So it's all
Could you pronounce that again?
Cthulhu.
Right, I still can't pronounce
So
it.
Lovecraft is the writer, and he writes
Okay.
all kinds of horror.
And Donna Haraway is the anthropologist who's been promoting the use of this term with very little take-up by the rest of humankind.
It makes sense to use it though, because the other terms, capitalism, plantation owners, men, they already have so much cultural baggage on them that to use a made-up word that can be used to describe this actually makes sense.
Well, I have some sympathy with that view, although I'd rather have one that can be pronounced and can be understood.
It's like foreign names. If you want to pronounce them, you can.
Yeah, but there is a barrier to entry, particularly, for example, for students. Okay, let me finish this up. Some other objections are that adopting the term and concept Anthropocene might invite unwelcome behavior. So there are people in the conservation biology community who say, okay, yeah, there's been a huge amount of environmental change and a lot of, and there's virtually nothing left that we can call pristine. But let's not say that out loud because it reduces the logic for conservation biology. If people think that there's nothing natural left, they're not going to want to conserve anything. So let's be quiet about it. A majority of a small minority of conservation biologists take this point of view. A second objection, which I think is stronger, is that recognizing the Anthropocene invites geoengineering. Again, if the planet has been put into a new place, so to speak, by human action already, then doesn't it make sense for humans to try to manage the planet and control the climate by, for example, injecting sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to control the amount of sunshine that reaches the lower atmosphere? And a lot of people, including me, find that moderately terrifying because things can go wrong with gigantic scale interventions in a system as complicated as the climate system. So that's an objection. Okay, there are geologists who don't like the idea. Some of them will say, let's check again in a million years. Some say if the Anthropocene is only going to be 70 years or at most 250 years, it's too short for us, not that useful. Some say this isn't science, this is a political intervention. And some say that the idea originated from an atmospheric chemist, not from within geology and stratigraphy, so how can that be legitimate? Let me just address the notion that it's political and therefore not scientific. That makes no sense. There's a lot of stuff in science that is political, and there always has been. The fact that something has political significance, or can have, doesn't mean it's not good science. Just think of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And Darwin had and still has political resonance, but it's good science. Last set of quarrels is about the date. So yeah, even if we do like the idea of the Anthropocene, and we're willing, perhaps grudgingly, to accept the term, well, when did it start? And the Anthropocene Working Group says about 1950. I'm on board with that. I voted for that. But there are a lot of other opinions out there. Some people think that with the early days of agriculture, enough methane was released into the atmosphere to change the climate, and we should say the Anthropocene began about 8,000 years ago. Others have more recent views, around 1492. Paul Crutzen originally said it should be tied to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and he liked the year 1784, when a particular improvement in the steam engine was patented. And a lot of the disagreement comes from what discipline people are trained in and what kind of evidence they like over other kinds of evidence.
Why do you like 1950?
Because of that whole basket of variables that I showed in the second slide, and because there's a lot of good, that's the sort of global environmental change reason. From the stratigraphical point of view, there's a lot of good potential markers in place around 1950, and if I got to choose, which I don't, it would be the layer of radioactivity associated with nuclear testing that can be dated very precisely and is going to last for hundreds of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years is good enough for me. There are some stratigraphers who think that the marker should have a longer preservation potential or durability than that. But there are things that probably will last even longer than that. Yeah.
How would prevent the sixth extinction, disappearance of wildlife, including elephants and stuff?
Yeah. Well, that also is going to produce a signal in the strata that is going to last for millions of years. And there are some members of the Anthropocene Working Group who are arguing for that as the key variable that's going to mark the Anthropocene. And as I say, by December, this is probably going to be sorted out within the Anthropocene Working Group, and then it has to work its way up through the bureaucracy of stratigraphy. And that's it. Thank you for your patience. I guess we have a few questions, and then we get to the Calumet region.
I enjoyed the talk. I like the setup between all the various fields and volunteer being in one of them. I'm one of the peculiar people you mentioned. So I appreciate the front end of stratigraphy battles. Philosophically, though, how would geologists know when it ends? Because if it ends, would there be geologists around? Or any other scientists or any other humans? That's my interesting comment.
This is one of the reasons I say that geologists are peculiar creatures, because in my conversations with the stratigraphers, they sometimes say, that's not a good choice because in a million years, that signal is going to disappear. And I say to them, in a million years, do you think there will be geologists? And are they going to think the same way that you do? And of course, they recognize the answer to those questions is probably no. But it doesn't matter. They still want a signal, a marker that is going to be detectable by the methods that geologists have now a million years from now. So, as human beings, we are all a bundle of
There's
inconsistencies.
tautology there.
And geologists are
Peculiar.
peculiar, but just like us, with different peculiarities.
They don't look for the end of an epoch, an era. What they're looking for is a beginning, and it will be for whatever comes next, for them to decide what the beginning of the next era
But
is.
historically, there's always an end to something else because they picked a beginning one. This one is sort of starting now, it doesn't have an end. If they're stuck in, we have to have an end. That's what I think.
Well, we-
Right,
So
it's
it's
open-ended.
The
Yes.
beginning of something
Right.
is the end of something else. They're looking for something that can be seen around the world that's relatively definitive.
But it's already back done because all these have been lined up till now. So they see when there's an end, when it begins by definition.
Hey, John, one of the things that I took away from your book was that, when you read and think about the Anthropocene, it's pretty horrifying, the future. But there's a piece of your book that you said, hey, why don't we consider some of these things? And you had a number of examples of positive change. I think one of them was the population growth. Also, alternative energies and the impact they're having on CO2. I can't remember the examples exactly, but maybe you could leave us with a little bit of
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. One, all environmental change is good for some and bad for others, or almost all. There may be some that's so extreme that it's good for no creatures. But the great majority is good for some, bad for others. I tend to adopt, I hope, a neutral tone and speak about change rather than destruction or degradation. However, I have to admit, a lot of people, when they listen to me or read what I write, don't see it that way and see a message of gloom and doom. But yeah, the whole Earth system is going to be in a radically different place, and we're moving there with remarkable speed. And that's going to be bad for some people and some creatures. It's going to be good for some people and some creatures. Will that balance out? It doesn't look like it to me. It looks like if you took it in net terms, it's going to be bad, more bad than good. But there are nonlinearities, unforeseeable features in complex systems, and that should make us a little bit humble about evaluating what is just in the beginning stages. With respect to population, the graph that I showed, while population continues to grow and rapidly by long-term historical standards, the rate of growth has been falling rapidly since 1968. There's every evidence that it's going to continue to fall in the decades to come. This is one of the more predictable parts of human behavior. Because it responds mainly to changes in fertility, and fertility responds powerfully to urbanization and formal education among females. And urbanization is proceeding apace. Formal education among females is expanding, not perhaps as rapidly as it did in previous decades, but it's still expanding. So that trend is set to continue pretty reliably. Population will stabilize and maybe begin to fall within 50 years. Demographic predictions are real good for 10 years. 50 years gets a bit shakier. But I'm personally pretty sure that population will peak well before the end of this century, and after that will likely slowly decline, which will ease some of the pressures that stand behind the trajectory of the curves that I showed you. With respect to energy, which in my view is the single most important variable in global environmental change, I also think that we're in the beginning stages of a big transition. Historically, all the transitions have been transitions that are additive. Additional new kinds of energy come on stream, and as I said before, the old ones don't go away. And so, for example, there's more coal burned now than there was 100 years ago, even though there's oil, natural gas, nuclear, etc., which scarcely existed 100 years ago. But I think that the next energy transition is going to be a bit different, and a bit and less additive, and involve more replacement. And it's going to be less carbon intensive, less methane intensive. Methane is another greenhouse gas, and although it's less important in the aggregate because less of it is in play than carbon dioxide, it's much more powerful than carbon dioxide in heating up the lower atmosphere. So I'm placing my hope here in a variety of renewable forms of energy that are either low carbon or zero carbon. And again, I think before the end of this century that that transition is going to be well underway, and that coal, oil, and natural gas are going to be reduced, not just added upon, but reduced significantly, and that changes the prospects for atmospheric chemistry and the climate system in a way that are likely to make it more stable and slower in its change. I think that's likely. But again, I feel we need to be humble in contemplating the future with all the unknowns and potential non-linearities involved.
Thanks so much.
Time for the Calumet.
Yeah.